Welcome to today's webinar on Dangermond Perspectives on Emerging Trends in GIS. My name is Christoph Janowitz. I'm a professor here at University of California, Santa Barbara, and the director of the Center for Spatial Studies. Trisalyn asked me to moderate today's event and also to close with my own remarks later on. She also asked me to keep the introduction of the speakers very brief. I guess we all know why. I'm sure you agree with me that just introducing the major accomplishments of today's speakers would take us the rest of the webinar. I will say this, however, I'm so excited to hear about their thoughts and their reactions to your questions. Speaking of these questions, please type them into the Q&A box below and I will paraphrase them for you and ask them to the panel. You will help me in doing so by keeping questions short and to the point. We also don't want this to be a one-way street, so we prepared 3 broad questions for you. You should see the very first of these questions in your Zoom window right now, and you can answer them if you like. Without any further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Trisalyn Nelson. Trisalyn joined the Department of Geography at UCSB as Jack and Laura Dangermond Endowed Chair of Geography in 2020. From 2016 to 2020, she was the director of the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning at Arizona State University. Prior to that, she was the Lansdowne Research Professor and Director of the Spatial Patterns Analysis and Research Lab at the University of Victoria, Canada. Trisalyn, the stage is all yours.
Thank you so much, Yano, and thank you everyone for being here. It's great to see the turnout, and of course, I'm just delighted that Jack and Mike could join us as well today. So when I was reflecting on what I wanted to talk about today, I started off thinking about emerging trends in technology and data, but I realized what I'm most excited about is growing trends in how we're doing GIS. And a trend that I think is worth celebrating and that I want to talk about today is what I see as the acceleration of empathy in GIS. Now, it's been a long, tough year for us, but from the perspective of GIS, I think it's also been really amazing. We've seen more Esri dashboards than ever before, and they've been instrumental in the management of COVID. I think even my mom and my kids have used, or at least viewed, an Esri dashboard in the last year. We've cheered Rebecca Jones, the Florida GIS professional who blew the whistle about bad public health policy based on her analysis of GIS data. So amidst, the dumpster fire of 2020, I think we've been reminded that GIS is incredibly powerful and that the work that we do as a GIS discipline is going to be really critical for addressing problems from climate change to social injustice. GIS is a field that is uniquely placed to integrate technology and empathy. And I think this is important because in fields like tech and data science, inclusion and ethical practice can be difficult. But because we anchor GIS and technology in the applications in the discipline of geography, I think that we have a collective conscience, and now is the time to really lean into that and to accelerate it. So as we dial up compassion and inclusion, both in regards to the knowledge that we generate, but also the people that we include in generating this knowledge, I think it's really exciting and something that we should be celebrating. So to illustrate these ideas, I just wanted to show you some examples from research. So the first is, for those of you who know me, you won't be surprised that I snuck in an image of bike maps here. So I'm really passionate about bicycling and bicycle data. Besides just it being super fun, bicycling is a technology that I believe will go hand in hand with our efforts to combat climate change and to overcome health disparities. But the reason that more people don't bike more often is because there are concerns about safety. And it's hard to improve bike safety because we lack good data to do so. So only about 20% of bicycling safety incidents are officially reported. So that means that if you're a planner who's trying to make better decisions about bike safety and improve it in your city, you don't have good data to do that. So in 2014, the Bike Maps team launched a crowdsourced tool for reporting bicycling incidents, and it's been used in 40 countries globally. Then we started to get down to analyzing this data, which is really was our main goal. And we realized that in order to analyze bike safety data, what you need is some denominator, some measure of the number of people exposed to a bike crash. So it's just like with COVID-19, where the raw counts of cases are not as useful as the rates, which are divided by the total population. Most cities don't have the funds to collect ridership data throughout their city. And so you end up with maybe a few locations where you have a counter, or you might have volunteer count programs that occur a couple times a year. And so the data are pretty incomplete. But Strava is a fitness app that's used globally. Over 75 million people use Strava. And so it means that we have this data set collected by a fitness app, which tracks a sample of ridership on every street segment and every minute of the day. So at any time, whether you knew you needed to collect the data or not, there's a Strava data set there that represents bicycling in your city. But the difficulty with using Strava for planning is that it's biased towards people that use the app. And people that use the app tend to include more men, more people mid-20s to mid-50s, more white people, avid bicyclists, people with higher incomes. And so if you use Strava for planning, you run the risk of excluding people who are already underserved by our transportation systems. But our team of data scientists just couldn't get over the overwhelming resolution of this data and extent of this data. And so we set out to determine if there was a way to solve the sample bias problem. And it turns out that there is. And the key to the solution is geography. So in cities, there's good correlation between the number of Strava riders and the number of total riders. It's just that the slope of the line varies. And that means that on a quiet residential street, one Strava bicyclist may correspond to 50 bicyclists, whereas on a busy multi-lane street, one Strava bicyclist may represent only 10 bicyclists. So if we integrate geography into our statistical models, we can predict quite accurately the total number of riders. And here's an example from Tempe, Arizona, where we were able to create a map of ridership with good accuracy. And so now we have a denominator for better understanding safety, but there's also been a wide range of uses for this data that we didn't anticipate. So people are interested in using them for monitoring, for planning where to put their bike infrastructure. And what started out as a project on bike safety has really become a research program around inclusive GIS data for urban planning. And addressing the bias in our data has been a mechanism for building empathy into our research. And what I see amongst my GIS colleagues, especially in the last year or two, is an acceleration of this similar process where you identify an information need, you find some data or technology, and then you ask yourself, how can this technology be used to create more inclusion, or will it create more exclusion? And if the answer is exclusion, it's an opportunity to innovate. Just as, I'm just as much a sucker for a new data set as the next GIS scientist, but I think it's really how we leverage these tools in conjunction with data that are going to determine our impact. When we think about integrating empathy into GIS, it's also critical to think about how we're doing this in our environmental research. If you define empathy as the ability to understand the feelings of another, there's plenty of evidence that the natural environment's not feeling well. The space-time patterns that we can illuminate from GIS allow us to give those systems a voice in a way that's really important for both scientific discovery and also for policy. In my work on grizzly bears in the Rockies, the bears sent us a clear signal that they weren't doing well when there were only 700 individuals left in the system. With GIS, we were able to illuminate a better understanding about what some of the issues were for the bears. And I think one of the best examples that best stories that we could tell for the bears using GIS was really around their stress. So cortisol is a hormone that all mammals produce, and we store it in our hair. It's the result of a fight or flight response. So if you have had a really bad 2020 and your hair's gone weird, you can maybe relate this to cortisol and not aging, as might be my case. When we modeled what was happening what the signal of the hair, the cortisol in the hair of the bears was telling us, we found this. So the areas to the west are the Rocky Mountains, which you can see outlined in red. And the cortisol values, the stress values for the bears in these areas are very high, and they're represented by yellow and red values. To the east and the north of this study area, you see blue values of cortisol, which actually indicate that the bears are under much less stress. This is surprising because in the areas that are blue, these are also areas of oil and gas exploration. There's a lot of human activity and resource extraction. But it turns out that because we suppress fires in the parks, the natural openings that are created in the areas where there's a lot of human activity create all this food for the bears. So right around the edges of the roads and the clear cuts, berries grow. And so the bears go there to eat. So the trouble with this, though, is that most of the bears die very near the roads. So we basically created an in-and-out burger where the bears go in, get their snacks, and then on the way out of the drive-through, they have a higher probability of dying from some kind of interaction with humans. Well, we don't want to anthropomorphize the bears too much. We do see that this example demonstrates how it's critical for us to use GIS to understand the complexity of social issues as well as environmental issues. And that GIS is really uniquely placed in allowing us to be able to quantify and illuminate the signals that the planet is sending us. You know, GIS brings empathy into the questions that we ask, but I also think it's important to consider who we're including in our team. And I'm really proud to be the first woman to hold the Jack and Laura Dangermond Chair in Geography. But our panel today includes only white people. And so I think it's also important to acknowledge that we have a number of leaders, both established and emerging, that are more diverse than the group represented today. You know, it's a really good exercise to go through a list of who do you collaborate with and who do you learn from. And these are some of the folks that I watch, and some of them I get to work with, that I'm learning from. And I think that if you find your list is not very diverse, I'd really encourage you to go and seek out some more diverse voices to learn from. You know, in GIS, we've had a long tradition of asking each other, is your analysis good? We really care about doing good research and good analysis, and we have mechanisms for reviewing each other and commenting on the work that we do. But I think we've also entered a time when we need to start asking each other, are we doing right analysis? And just like, you know, I would expect someone to ask me if the distance, how did I define the distance threshold in my analysis, or how did I set my bandwidth on my kernel density estimator? I think it's also okay for us to ask, what is the impact of your work? Are you doing something that is making the world better? Are you including the right people in your data? How is this going to improve the world? GIS professionals can be leading in social justice and climate change. And I know for me, those are really important things. And that I hope that for others, you know, we can accelerate the work that we do that has a positive impact. Thank you.
Trisalyn, thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I'm sure everybody is clapping, you just can't hear them due to our virtual format. You should all see the second question now on our screens, and I hope you will take a minute to fill them out while I introduce our second speaker, who is just setting up his screen, namely Jack Dangermond. Jack Dangermond is the founder and president of Esri. With a background in landscape architecture and urban design, he and his wife Laura founded Esri in 1969 on the idea that computer-based mapping and analysis could make significant contributions to geographic planning and environmental science. Since then, Esri has become the global market leader in GIS and location intelligence. Dangermond has received many acknowledgements and awards for his contributions to the fields of geography, environmental science, planning, and GIS, including 13 honorary degrees. Jack, if you're ready to share your screen, we are very much looking forward to your presentation.
Good. Can you see that okay, Janos?
We can hear and see and hear clearly. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Well, that was really an interesting presentation, Trisalyn. I have sort of a phrase about it, being interested versus being interesting. It's something that's been in the back of my mind forever. In a way, being interested is sort of having empathy for others or interested in subjects who are interested in the science. So I liked it very much. What Trisalyn asked that I talk about is the emerging trends, but I colored it a little bit with emerging technology trends, and I'll go through these very, very quickly. But I would like to acknowledge that geography and GIS, its digital twin, we might say, have never been more important. And the examples that we talk about and that we see, I sort of enjoy this interesting privileged position of watching the world go by in GIS applications. And it's just amazing what I see every day. And it's growing. You know, there was a famous conversation between Bill Gates and Paul Allen about that they would see a day when laptops would be in every office in the world. And what I'm beginning to realize is that GIS is going to be in every organization supporting with geographic science, virtually every kind of operation, whether it's agriculture or whatever in the planet. So this is going to help us have empathy or help us understand our world and manage our world better. That's the big vision. The GIS technology itself is playing a role in this. It's co-evolving with these applications very rapidly. And it's not just the core GIS technologies, but it's also the integration of those technologies with lots of other tools, cloud computing, advanced analytics, GeoAI, and so on. And that's having the effect of transforming organizations at all scales and all sizes. I picked 9 things that underpin what I think is creating a kind of geospatial revolution. You can glance at these briefly. The biggest one, I think, is the geospatial infrastructure pattern, a new pattern in GIS, but also cloud-based systems, new features and functions in analytics, and ultimately the deployment of this technology to the field. Sorry, I will start by talking about number 1, geospatial infrastructure as a pattern. So GIS is actually currently being used by at least 10 million people, and they're doing it in desktop patterns, enterprise server patterns, in hundreds of apps that reach millions of people, and also it's increasingly becoming embedded. But these separate patterns are also becoming integrated thanks to the web and cloud environments into a new pattern that I would characterize as a geospatial infrastructure pattern or a system of systems. And that pattern is supporting the ability for all kinds of organizations and people to participate in the sharing and collaboration of their knowledge or their experiences. I just call it GIS at scale. And it's using web services to bring together virtually every kind of information, every kind of format, from traditional vector maps to 3D images to voxels to structured, unstructured data. All of it is coming together through this network kind of architecture. And it's not just the raw data that's happening, it's also consolidated data in things like BIM models or landscape models or city models, replicating, I mean, a popular term these days is the digital twin, replicating geography at scale in a digital environment. And this is opening up with maps and dashboards. Trisalyn already talked about the corona map done by Johns Hopkins. That's now been viewed over 2 trillion times. Billions of observations of this map are still happening daily. And that's just one site. There were thousands of sites that really told a story, but that's only one story. And there's many stories being told. Billions and billions and billions of these kind of maps are making our society generally conscious of geography and the relationships and patterns that are there. And it's not just maps, it's also apps, not only web apps, but also in mobile deployments that are connecting people in the field with sourcing of information, but also driving information and knowledge, helping them be more empathetic. And the high-end advanced visualization and analytics of all types are leveraging new scientific innovations that are outside of our field, but also integrating with our field. This is transformational to our, as Trisalyn said, our understanding or empathy for our world. The second big pattern that's emerging is we're moving rapidly to the cloud. And this is happening with enabling tools like a new operating system for the cloud called Kubernetes, which is cloud native, which allows us to scale up problems of a massive scale like climate change or like the weather or like the oceans, all in one environment. And this is increasingly being made available through SaaS, and also the cloud is giving us a pattern of being able to open up services so that developers can actually have access to this knowledge at a massive scale. A third one is real-time information collected from IoT and real-time data computed in the cloud, being able to do dynamic visualization so that mere mortals can actually connect to this real-time observational information and use it for analysis at massive scales. Fourth is imagery is now going to the cloud with raster GIS, so we can take advantage of all the Landsat data for 40 years and begin to analyze it by a browser or by a desktop. This is going to transform how we do analytics in the university, being able to do university projects easily without having the friction that we've held back in the past, and visualize and do amazing work. A fifth big trend is that GIS itself is opening up more for developers. New APIs, new SDKs, and particularly open source APIs that could access the core knowledge of data and analytic models is being made available. And that is fueled again with the geospatial infrastructure of content about everything and about everywhere. A sixth trend, and you might ask why I put this in, is the integration of reality capture. This is a 3D picture. That's how I describe this mesh. But this is of Frankfurt, and it's a beautiful picture. People flew it with an aircraft. They processed it into this block, and it's just beautiful, isn't it? And yet it's also this picture that can be looked at fused with the vector information. So I can fly around it, I can play with it, I can interact with it, I can colorize the buildings based on the vector data that's invisibly there. So it's a new kind of city. It's a new kind of reality presentation. This will become a standard in GIS's experiences. A seventh one is well known to virtually all of the audience here, which is spatial analytics are creating more understanding. And the frontiers here are in big data analytics and warehouses, and also the integration of GeoAI and machine learning and deep learning. But look at this interesting thing on the left here of time series forecasting integration with GIS. This is work by Lauren Bennett, who's really pushing the envelope with COVID of looking at the curve and then seeing its movement, spatially. Being able to forecast the impaction on hospitals, for example, are easy to understand. And speaking about GeoAI, this is becoming very exciting, and it's becoming simpler. So I can actually access the rich and interesting open source libraries that the data science communities are making, and access it from GIS and use it inside of GIS to do all kinds of automation work, but also create new understandings of relationships and patterns and predictions. And then my ninth one is the integration of GIS with field operations. I think, Michael, you were the first one to really begin to push this years ago in Santa Barbara. And I just was sort of blown away by it. It must be now 15 years ago, the idea that you could take a little bit of GIS into the field. And this has evolved now to where we can see what people are doing in the field. We see where they're doing it in the field. They're observing things, whether it's taking the census last year or in the Philippines or here in the US, and rolling it into the cloud and then doing immediate processing, looking at polio immunization in Baghdad and seeing it in Zurich on dashboards, how things are progressing. The whole field is connecting in with the enterprise. And that promises to transform every industry and all sorts of work. Well, Trista, those are my big 9 ideas. They're technologies, they're the big ones, at least for me this year, that I think promise to make enormous change in our field. So I'll just stop here and we'll move on. So, Janos.
Thank you so much, Jack. That was one wonderful presentation. You should all see the third question now on your screen while I introduce you to our third speaker, Mike Goodchild. And Mike, you can already use the time to set up your screen sharing. Until 2012, Mike held the Jack and Laura Dangermond Chair of Geography and was director of UCSB's Center for Spatial Studies. If you would like to say it this way, Mike co-created, so to speak, both Trisalyn's and my current positions. Mike directed or co-directed several other very large funded projects, including the National Center for Geographic Information and Analysis, the Alexandria Digital Library, and the Center for Spatially Integrated Social Sciences. He was elected member of the US National Academy of Sciences in 2002 and foreign member of the Royal Society and corresponding fellow of the British Academy in 2010. In 2007, he received the Prix Veron Lut, I hope I'm not butchering the name here, in his career so far. Mike is laughing, so probably I did. And he published over 550 books and articles. Mike, we are looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, everyone, for attending, and thank you for this wonderful idea, Trisalyn, of pulling this webinar together. I'd like to talk about 2 specific trends, and the first one is, well, they both really are very general. They both build on what has already been said. The first builds very much on what Jack has said, and the second very much on what Trisalyn has said. I want to imagine yourself, let's say, back in 2005. And what would your reaction be to what you observe today? What has happened essentially since 2005 in this wonderful field of geospatial infrastructure? And I want to suggest that the one thing you would notice above all is abundance. And that will be surely very evident from Jack's presentation and from many other things that we see happening. It's abundance in terms of computing. Because finally, people in the geospatial community are beginning to use high-performance computing in projects such as cyber GIS. Jack has talked about the cloud and about online GIS. We have abundant computing these days. Secondly, data. And we've heard already about the huge increases in the availability of imagery, the trend towards open data, the social media data that many people are using, volunteered geographic information. All of these amount to an enormous increase in the availability of data. We'd have to say the same about software, because we have now seen enormous advances in the open source community, in ArcGIS Pro, the addition of spatial functions to packages such as R. And finally, of course, people. And today, the size of the geospatial community is immensely greater than it has been in the past. It's still growing exponentially. It consists, of course, of professionals, but increasingly of amateurs. The whole concept of neo-geography. And all of this amounts to, I think, a very significant reduction in the old limitations. If you look at the history of GIS, the way that GIS was initially developed was very much a response to very severe limitations on computing, on availability of data, on software. And those kinds of limitations are now disappearing rapidly. So that would be my first point, that abundance really characterizes the field that we find ourselves in today. How have we responded to abundance? And I think we might ask that question in many different ways. But let me suggest first that we are seeing finer spatial resolution. So the kinds of analysis that we used to do based on, let's say, census tract data are increasingly possible at the individual level, at the level of the individual block, at the level of the parcel. And we're increasingly familiar with pixels that are smaller than a square meter. We've also seen enormous advances due to LiDAR, particularly in the area of digital elevation models. And now we can go way down in terms of spatial resolution for digital elevation data. And HD maps, high density maps, which are being developed rapidly to support autonomous vehicles, are at a level of spatial resolution that we've never seen in the past, and really capitalizes on this concept of abundance. We can say something similar about the finer temporal resolutions, about tracking and trajectories, about real-time GIS and the popularity of dashboards, about data coming from the Internet of Things, about 4D representations, such as sorts of things that Jack has talked about. And this might have been, let's say, 30 years ago, an impressive map of language across the Earth's surface. And just to use this as an illustration, suppose you were to ask this map the very simple question: what language do they speak in Chicago? And if you were particularly adept at finding Chicago on that map, you might conclude that everyone in Chicago speaks English, or everyone in London speaks English. And of course, reality is very, very different. And today we can get down to this sort of level. This is a map from Paul Longley's group at UC University College London. And the users hovered over Camden, over that beautiful color designating Japanese. And you're seeing a total population in a particular enumeration district of 262 people, of whom 22% speak Japanese at home. That kind of detail is something we've never had in the past, allows us to ask all sorts of new questions of the kinds of data we are now having access to. Just one final point about this. This is the data cube. And what I'm showing is how traditionally we've examined the data cube from a geospatial perspective by slicing it horizontally. And today, of course, with increased temporal resolution, we can stack more and more layers together and ask questions, interesting questions that involve something other than going up to horizontal slices. We can ask, for example, what happens to a particular pixel through time in this data cube? One thing I very much regret, and I wish we were better at it, the metaphor of the data cube does tend to reinforce the notion that the Earth is flat. And I do wish we had a metaphor more like this, where we can peel layers off an onion instead of slicing a data cube. Perhaps we'll find ways of visualizing that will support that kind of perspective. Stacking horizontal layers or peeling a globe, which is the more useful metaphor and which teaches us more about the Earth. GeoAI, I think of in many ways as an inevitable consequence of abundant computing power and abundant data. It was inevitable in a sense that we would go in this direction of GeoAI. It's important, I think, to notice how long, in fact, GeoAI has been around. Now, if we go back to 1992, when Stan Openshaw established his geocomputation lab in Leeds, University of Leeds, and the 1997 book on artificial intelligence in geography. It's very interesting to look back at what we thought of as artificial intelligence at that time. And it's very, very different from the sorts of computational neural networks that we now think about. It was much more theory-based. And here's a very simple example from the work of Stan back in fact, the 1980s, in which he used what was then quite limited computing power to conduct a relatively simple experiment on data about childhood leukemia. This is ALL. And this is Northern England. And he had simply programmed a strategy of throwing circles of random sizes and at random locations on the map, and testing each circle to see if the number of cases inside the circle exceeded statistical expectations, and if they did, drawing the circle. And this was the result after tens of thousands of circles. There are two clusters here that are significant. The C-scale one, which is related to a British nuclear fuels reprocessing plant, and the Tyneside one, which Stan, I think, believed that this had something to do with the existence of a garbage incinerator in Newcastle. These days, I think GeoAI has expanded enormously, and the kinds of questions that it asks are now very different, and in a way much less theory-based. So many examples of GeoAI are basically find similar examples. And this is from the work of Wenwen Lee at Arizona State, based on training a package to recognize craters, and then playing that over the surface of the Earth to identify additional craters. This sort of finds similar, very powerful in its ability to scan enormous amounts of imagery and to find examples across the Earth's surface. The second point, the second topic I wanted to cover was ethics, because it's interesting and notable, and I think Trisalyn has already made this point very effectively, that ethics is somehow now on many people's minds in the geospatial community. Ethics, of course, is a vast canvas, and we think about everything from locational privacy, which is perhaps what motivates many people to start thinking about ethics, to working on human subjects, to inferences from spatial data, to provenance and uncertainty of data, to the implementation of geospatial results in decision-making, and even to staffing and JEDI, issues of diversity. I did a little experiment yesterday and looked through the 2 volumes that the group and I published in 1991 on GIS, 72 chapters, of which precisely 2 involved women. I looked also at the history of GIS published by Tim Forsman in 1998. 1 chapter involved a female author. I often get asked, who do I think is the father of GIS? And one of my responses immediately is, well, that's fine, but who is the mother? And if you look, of course, at the history of GIS, it's extremely difficult to find any women involved in the early years of GIS. And of course, teaching practices raise their own issues of ethics. So my point simply is that considering ethics in relation to geospatial infrastructure is a vast topic. It has, for some reason, attracted a great deal of attention recently. The American Geographical Society has its Ethical Geo project. The American Association of Geographers, in collaboration with Esri and UCSB, has its Geoethics project. OGC has a Geoethics project. And the United Nations has a project on teaching geospatial ethics. All of these current. Why now then? Why in particular? And let me suggest a few possible reasons. One is, of course, Black Lives Matter and JEDI. It's very much a question on everybody's minds at this point. Secondly, a need to update earlier ethics standards. The ethics standard from the AAG dated 2009, and I suggest badly needs updating. And a need to broaden from a focus on GIS to a focus on the entire field of geospatial infrastructure and geographic research. And perhaps in part, this is driven also by a new abundance of geospatial infrastructure, which was my first point. And perhaps finally, an urgency because of COVID. Perhaps we are being asked to do science faster, and doing science faster inevitably raises issues of an ethical nature. So how should we prioritize? Some of these issues are not specific to geospatial infrastructure, issues of staffing and issues of teaching. But in the current climate, we can't ignore them. And as Tris made abundantly clear, empathy in relation to GIS, it's everybody's problem, but it's also a very significant problem in GIS. Some of these issues are more closely aligned with our individual interests, and my interests are in uncertainty and inference. And I just wanted to leave you with one example of what I think of as a key example in the issue of inference from geospatial data. This goes back, of course, to the snow map of 1854. This is the London outbreak of cholera in 1854 in the Soho area. And this is a map, I've done this by mashing a map of London in 1843, courtesy of David Rumsey, with the deaths, which are the green symbols, and also the sources of water, which are the red triangles. And of course, the key pump that Snow identified is right there in the middle of the outbreak. But think about this for a moment. because there are three possible arguments which could equally well explain this pattern. Snow got the right one, and Snow was able to conduct an experiment on a human population, which would be very difficult to do these days. He was able to lock the pump. And as a result, he turned this into a controlled experiment. But three other possible explanations. The dominant one at the time was miasma, bad air, and you could quite easily have got this pattern from bad air. You could also get this pattern because of contagion, if a super spreader happened to locate next to the pump. And you could also get this pattern from a population at risk, if there was a particular population of people in this district who happened to be susceptible to cholera. So three possible explanations. So just to sum up, summary points. Number one, abundance is, I think, what we would notice most about the field at this particular point. A vast range of ethical issues. The importance of uncertainty, because the map is not the territory, the data are not necessarily the truth. And finally, inference from geospatial data must always be very cautious. So thank you very much for your attention.
Mike, thank you so much for your wonderful talk. We will now dive directly into the Q&A session. As you probably saw, I've already answered some of them, many in private to you. And I will now pick a few and paraphrase them a bit. You should also now, or just in a second, be able to see the results of the polls, and you can click on them and look how your fellow panel members and the audience voted. And let me briefly start with one question from the audience here that I think very nicely matches one of the key topics today. The question is, I would love to hear insights from each speaker about how we can use GIS to create a safer place to live. And this person mentions, among one thing, for instance, preventing hate attacks. Would this be something that you panelists would like to briefly answer to? So what's the role of GIS in creating safe spaces?
As Mike and Jack were talking, I was thinking about a thread that I think connects to this this question, which is, I was showing some high resolution data that's high resolution both in space and time, as was Mike. And Jack showed us those amazing 3D representations of our cities, which can now be done in such a detailed way. And so I do think that there's something about the level of detail that we're getting at that allows individual experience to be communicated more effectively, and probably provides us a mechanism for understanding variation in a range of processes, including things that impact our safety. So I just think that there's, there's sort of a fabric to hang some of these questions on that is much more detailed than it has been in the past, both spatially and temporally.
Yeah, my thought initially is, what are the areas that are at high risk? And in the private sector, insurance companies are really mapping these and suggesting through their rates that you don't build in high risk areas. That's one interpretation of what safe means. Another thought that comes to mind is, with increased surveillance, areas become less crime associated. So geographic coverage of surveillance is going to increase, I suppose. And yeah, those are my first two thoughts. Finding the places that are safe and finding the places that are the opposite, at risk, and then promoting being in those places from a practical application perspective, building in those places from a practical application. And it's not just earthquakes and fires, it's also what's safe for us as human beings. Like, is the destruction of biodiversity a safe strategy? No, we should do the Ed Wilson protect half Earth so that we are all safer by putting those areas in conservation. So those are the first thoughts that come to mind when you bring up this creating safer places with GIS.
Yeah, I think if we think of safety as an attribute of a location, Then we can build that sort of information into wayfinding. Apps that recommend particular routes can be made to recommend routes that are safer versus routes that are faster or shorter. I think also this is something that VGI is already playing a significant role in the form of apps that allow citizens to report unsafe conditions. So Fix My Street kinds of apps are now, of course, very common. So I think there are many ways in which this could be treated as a matter of communication, how information about safety gets acquired and communicated, how it gets shared. And of course, if you regard safety as a function of place, then immediately GIS becomes an obvious candidate, obvious kind of technology.
Last week, I looked at a really interesting map, Mike, that showed the perception of safety in the era of COVID. And they showed certain street corners really unsafe, like they were, this would be a bad place to be because it's their perception. No, it's all crowdsourced information.
Yeah.
And the other thought that occurs to me is safe for the individual, like route finding, like you're saying, but also this broader meaning of safety for society. You know, what are the geographies that we really need to deal with in order to create that communal safe strategy, like biodiversity conservation.
Yeah.
I would like to take us into the next question, which aligns very well. We talked today a lot about big data and the presence of data, and one of the people asking wonderful question here reminds us that sometimes the sparsity of the data maybe tells us also a story in its own rights. This person asks, what are your thoughts on the importance of empowering communities, particularly those in the margins, to truly tell their own stories, not just the stories we define by defining the data models or the challenges, but the narratives from their perspective? So how do we tell the stories, if I may paraphrase, that are not supported by big data, for instance, or by predefined schemata?
Yeah. I think this has been one of the very significant trends over the past decade or so, where we have made it much easier. We've accepted the notion that there is no single map, that a map is a social construction, that maps can reflect the attitudes of individuals and can be very different from the kinds of maps that are officially produced. And that trend, I think, has been, as I say, extremely significant over the past few years. I think it has a long way to go. And I think that in some parts of the world, it still is extremely difficult to get any kind of information shared that is not the official perspective. Things like alternative names of places become very significant and very, very different from the old attitude, which was that every place has one official name and only one. Even names can be tremendously important in expressing how people feel about a place.
I also think that who we're training with the power of GIS is really important. So, you know, if we think that early on GIS might have been a hammer in our toolbox, well, now I think it's the crane that we use to build the skyscrapers. You know, the discipline has matured to the point that we are leading innovation and leading the ability to find solutions. And so it matters a lot who we empower with that. So I think as you know, for folks on the call who are in higher ed, I do think that we need to commit to thinking about how do we diversify the folks that we are engaging in GIS and geography education, because it's really by sharing that knowledge and power that we are going to be able to hear those stories more clearly.
Yeah, the concept of storytelling really fascinates me. Alan Carroll a few years ago worked with a team to invent this thing called story maps. Over like 1.3 million story maps were published last year. And each of those maps tells a story. Its intention is to tell a story. And as that kind of technology continues to evolve, it's going to become a platform for people to tell their story. So currently, GIS-based cartography is held by a few, and they are telling stories about science or telling stories about vegetation or telling stories about demographics or ethnicity or whatever it is. And when you look at most of the maps that are produced, they don't really tell stories very well. So there's a huge gap between the ambition to tell a good story and the cartography that is coming out of most of the professionals' minds. And as we transform story maps into a social media, like Facebook, it'll be much more powerful than these other social medias, because it'll tell the stories about our world, about human experience. And I want to tell my story about going to Disneyland, or I want to tell my story about going to Yosemite, or I want to tell my story about my neighborhood. I want to tell my story about police brutality in downtown LA. My story as a kid is, you know, a 10-year-old or a 20-year-old. So my sense is that cartography is the next generation of language for the world. And geography is the foundation science on which we will tell those stories. And location will be the center point of that geographic science. So, man, I should have said it earlier that the big trend that I see is that maps will become storytelling expressions that help us have more empathy, to use your word, Trisalyn, to create more understanding. And you're right, Michael, there isn't going to be just one story. There's many stories. You know, all of us have seen these movies where, you know, one person saw the same circumstances, but they told their story differently than another person. I just watched a cowboy movie about that, you know, two people seeing exactly the same scene, but had completely made up different stories about it. If we take the billions of people that are existing and they have the opportunity to tell their story about geography, and we create a more spatially literate, you know, cartography language-based world, wow, it will get them to have more empathy. That's my thought. You know, I can see your point of view. I can see your experience, seeing exactly the same circumstances through the language of a map, and especially an interactive map. And then there'll be the bringing these maps together and comparing. And you know, it's why the hell did these other social medias take off? Because they offered the opportunity to tell your story.
Yeah.
But we're just, I think, at the beginning of that in our space.
I think the intersection between academic writing and the story map is going to be very interesting over the next little while. Tomorrow, I have to review a report from Washington State University in response to a contract from the state of Washington on water conditions in the Skagit River. And that report is in the form of a story map.
Yes.
Which is going to be totally different from the old style of reports, which were academic-ese.
Yes.
And it's going to be very interesting to see how they've managed to do it.
And there'll be story collections. Let's call them storybooks. I mean, Alan has already invented that metaphor. So you can bring data together, you know, a collection of story maps about a geography, like a national park or a downtown scene. So I just say this is going to reach this is going to empower. You know, I read a book about Disney recently. You know, his big thing was storytelling. And he had the animation studios and he had the film and Disneyland. Disneyland is really a bunch of little stories that we go to and experience them, right? So story maps are this language that allows us to express just about stories about everything. And so I just say this is going to rip. And there'll be interactive story map-based books. I can just simply say, I know that at the highest levels of government, in this government, but also other governments, they're briefed every day with story maps. They're telling, you know, the story of what's going on in this place in the world or that place in the world. Leaders are going to come to accept it, and they'll want to see citizen participation in storytelling collectives. So I don't know where it'll go. It'll take a little bit of social science and ethics brought together here to guide it and develop a kind of geojournalism Okay, it's telling stories about circumstances, and I think that'll bust open. I mean, James Fallows is doing journalism. He just started a new NGO back in DC to take his whole profession of journalism and geoize it with mapping. And his wife just told a wonderful story about American libraries using these story maps. So I think our little field will go far using that more democratization of geospatial storytelling. And I think as a profession, we need to be very critical of the maps that people make. You know, I have this friend, Richard Saul Werman. He goes to the user conference every year, and he says he throws up looking at all the maps because they don't tell a story. He says, what were you trying to intentionally create, you know, through this map? And if you study it long enough, I mean, I have the same problem now. I'm starting to relate with his frustration is we need to grow that dimension, particularly with real-time geographic information, grow the discipline and the dimension of cartography to embrace this idea of not just making a map of overlaid junk, but really telling a story.
We have roughly 60 more questions. Of course, we're not going to get to all of them, but if I may, there are three main branches of questions. One is about ethics and surveillance and so on. We had 2 questions on this. There's an entire set of questions on VGI and crowdsourcing and so on. And then there are many, many questions about technology, about starting a GIS company, about how to do this, about technology transfer. So let me paraphrase all of them into one final question and hoping for your brief answers. Technology transfer between academia and industry is not a one-way street. What is your experience in walking the line between these 2 areas, and how can we make academia and industry grow closer together?
Well, I'm sure that Jack and Mike have a much longer experience with this than me because they've worked together for so long. But one thing that I found working with industry that is so satisfying for both me and my students is that the challenges that industry needs addressed are often, I mean, it's often because there's a use for them. And so when academics have an opportunity to work in that space, I think it actually creates a lot of enthusiasm amongst students that we're working on things that have an application that we know that will have an impact. So I just have noticed a real appetite amongst students for doing this kind of work.
Agreed. I think this kind of activity, as we're doing it today, right? This kind of activity is enormously valuable for teaching. I think one has to take a very measured view of interaction and not look for things that are particularly obvious. Not look for some invention which gets snapped up by some company and lots of money is made. But look instead at a continuing dialogue, such as I like to think I have with Jack, where the company and I exchange ideas of a very long period of time. I tend to feel really good when there is some idea that I have discussed at some meeting, which within some reasonable length of time shows up in a new development in some company. Those kinds of things are very rewarding. But what's even more rewarding is the ability to use examples in our own teaching. And for years, I would spend every Friday in Ottawa or in Toronto working with companies, and I would go back into class on Monday morning and I would talk about what I'd done and talk about the topics we'd been considering. I think the more we can do to break down the barriers between academia and industry, the better. And we are, I think, I always felt extremely lucky being in Santa Barbara and knowing that Santa Barbara was one place where Jack would like to come with Laura, and we could build on that by a continued dialogue. So this sort of activity that we're engaged in today, I think, is exactly what's needed to break down the barriers between industry and academia.
I had an old friend, Mr. Sakaguchi in Japan. He once gave me one of these, calligraphy things that said, "Good friendship is most important." And it was such a beautiful saying, and I've used it throughout my whole life. The relationship that you and I have, Michael, of just being friends and being able to explore interesting ideas has been really profound for me. It's impacted my way of thinking. You've impacted my way of thinking. And I've had this thought that you have been impacted through some of what we have done as well. And so this kind of a co-evolution of friendships between not so much formal, one company, one university, but friendships of a professional nature where you can really co-evolve what's happening in the science and science thinking area and technology, co-evolving those thoughts together through long periods of time really have helped. So it speaks not just between the academy and the private sector, but between our users inspire me, they give me direction because they have real problems that I have to work on, and they give me ideas and my colleagues ideas that they work on in terms of trying to help them do their job better. So yeah, it's probably worth sharing that one of the core philosophies of Esri is to build really great software tools that help our users do their work better. Every one of those words matters. Better matters, do their work, build great, well-engineered software tools. All of those words really connect into this phrase. And having, as a general philosophy, some of you've asked questions about, how do you do a GIS business? Well, from my perspective, the thing I want to share with you is have humility and figure out who you serve and get that wired into your head. Are you serving, get rich quick stockholders or venture capital, or are you serving your users? And in our case, we sort of just had the privilege because we grew very slowly to make it up that what we would do is serve our customers. And they would pay us money and we would work on this engineering, and you have to listen very carefully and also bring in sources of knowledge from the academy and elsewhere and listen very carefully to the evolving technical changes and also be inspired. All those things are important to really be successful in a geospatial business, but any kind of business, I suppose. So it's an issue of really honestly accepting that you're in service to others.
Thank you so much. I was asked to provide also a brief summary of our webinar today and also add my own thoughts, and I hope to do so in a thought-provoking way. But before doing so, I wanted to thank our speakers again for the wonderful talks and the great insights that they shared with us and this very familiar discussion. But I also wanted to highlight Kat and Alex, who are with us here in the room, and they made all the technology work, and this was quite a lot of work, I can tell you. So big thanks to them. Yeah. So coming to my closing remarks, I believe that sometimes it helps to think about the defining characteristics of spatial data as competing forces. On the one hand, spatial dependency forms the backbone of many of our most popular inferencing services. On the other hand, spatial heterogeneity puts bounds on how far we can generalize our insights, especially at different scales. These days, and especially with regards to the geo-AI literature, I see most of us exploiting the first characteristic, so dependency, and quite frankly speaking, ignoring the second one, heterogeneity. The last years have taught us that generalizing and classifying with a broad brush may increasingly conflict with our vision of society. Having spent almost a decade now in what is these days called geo-AI, I'm reminded of a quote from Stephen Harnad that says that all cognition is categorization. Many of us have stated for, well, also almost a decade now, that we can achieve interoperability while at the same time respecting the beauty of heterogeneity, in this case, semantic heterogeneity. On the other hand, standardizing meaning and coming up with crisp global definitions for geographic space and our experience in geographic space nicely aligns or feeds the hunger of GIS technologies that rely on vast amounts of labeled data. I think we need to have a serious discussion about which price we are willing to pay for a better perceived accuracy of the GIS technologies we develop and publish in our papers. I don't think there will be any simple answers for that, but I think that finding these answers will define who we are as a community. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the panel as much as I did. Thanks again to our wonderful speakers. Thanks again for showing up, and thanks again for all your insightful questions. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jano. Bye.
Thank you, Jano. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.